All right, welcome to the video. This one's on nuclear power, which is going to be the last of our non-renewable resource videos. This is a form of energy that was extremely popular for a period of time. People thought the world of it in the 1950s, and we've really put a lot of government money by subsidizing since then, but it's kind of underperformed our expectations. It hasn't quite met the goals we had hoped it would. The nice things with nuclear power is that there are very low CO2 emissions, so you're not burning anything in this. You are going to produce some CO2 during the processing side of things, but it's not going to use any up when you're actually creating the nuclear power. There is something known as the nuclear fuel cycle, which is where we go from mining the uranium. The uranium that we pull out of the ground can't be just plugged into the nuclear power plant and generating power. It's too spread out. Otherwise, we'd be producing an awful lot of heat underground where these minerals were found. And so it goes through a lot of processing and enriching to become fuel uranium. And so they come out as these little pellets. After that, we can use it in a reactor. And once it's spent up, so once it's gone through several cycles and it runs out of the right type of uranium, we need to safely store it somewhere for a really, really long time. These wastes are around for essentially ever on a human scale of things. So this is the nuclear fuel cycle I just explained to you, and you can see it's a pretty intricate and extensive process. Because of this fuel cycle, nuclear power has very low energy returned on energy invested, potentially negative, which would mean that it costs more to make than it makes you in the long run. And so you'd end up using more energy through the extraction and enriching process than you would get out of the use of nuclear power once you have it enriched and extracted. So it's something interesting to point. The reason why it's able to survive with this potentially negative energy return on energy invested, it would kind of depend on the plant and the process itself, but it's so close to zero that we kind of think it's going to be negative in the long run. Is because of the government money, right? These guys get subsidized by the government to keep open and keep running. We like that because it reduces our dependence on foreign oil, and so we're less vulnerable to OPEC and global oil prices if we can rely a little bit on this nuclear power. This is what a nuclear power plant would look like, and so there's a lot of different parts to it, but kind of the iconic feature of the nuclear power plant are these cooling towers, just like we have in our coal plant. They serve the same purpose here in nuclear power, but this is the interesting part. So the nuclear reactor in here has control rods, which are letter B, and it also has the fuel rods, which are letter K. And so these fuel rods, if the radioactive decay, the particles, the alpha particles, beta particles, and gamma particles they're emitting are allowed to hit another fuel rod, it might split that one and release some more of those particles. And so we can control how much energy, how much heat these produce by raising and lowering the fuel rods. And so by having them all the way down and lowered, we don't change the fuel rods, we lower and raise the control rods. By lowering the control rods all the way down, we're preventing any kind of nuclear reactions from happening, and so we're producing no heat, and it's a safe scenario. As we raise them up, the heat increases because we're allowing those rods to interact with one another, and as the heat increases, it boils the water, just like we did with burning the coal, and that hot water that it produces goes to spinning this turbine. You can see we're making steam in here, which spins the turbine, which goes to the generator, which goes to the transformer, which we can ship it out. The water that we're heating then also needs cooled eventually, so we can keep a nice flow of water going through it. Some hot spots, some places to know for nuclear power. The first one is the Yucca Mountain Repository, and so this is out in Nevada, and in 2002 we approved it as a deep underground repository. And so essentially what we created was a spot to store nuclear fuel forever, essentially, indefinite storage of nuclear fuel. And so eventually the funding was cut in 2009, and so it's not been used, and we don't really have any long-term storage options. So a lot of the nuclear power plants in the United States actually just store right on site. The reason why it was cut, it's a very controversial thing. The people around Yucca Mountain, not a lot of them, but Nye County, Nevada does have some residents, were very opposed to storing all the country's nuclear waste in their backyard, as you might understand why. And then the other thought was this would be a very potentially high risk spot for terrorists, and we'd eventually be paying to support that the security and the functionality of this site forever, which is a pretty large cost when you think about it. Some other places to know for nuclear is Chernobyl, which is in the Ukraine. What happened in Chernobyl is we had a pair of explosions in one of the reactors, and so you can see that this is where that explosion occurred, and that explosion was because we had a meltdown. And so the meltdown happened, the fuel rods and the enclosure that the fuel rods were in actually burned for 10 days. You're talking steel and concrete burning for 10 days. The cloud of radioactive debris from the explosion encircled the planet. It was so vast. And so there's really difficult to estimate the cause or the health effects of this, but it's estimated anywhere between 9,000 to 212,000 people have died prematurely, cancer or other sicknesses due to this. Essentially, the response to this explosion was to cover it with a concrete sarcophagus, and so that's essentially like a giant coffin that they just lowered over this, like a big dome they lowered over top of this. Part of that collapsed in 2013 and kind of made some news. The inside of this concrete structure then was so pockmarked and destroyed by how radioactive the reactor is currently. So it's still a big problem. The whole town around it, Pripyat, is still evacuated, and there's still warnings on how much time you can even spend in the surrounding town due to the radioactivity in the background. So how dangerous it is. Another really big one is 3 Mile Island in 1979. So these are fairly close together. Only 7 years separated them. 3 Mile Island is in the United States, up in Pennsylvania. And so this is our only major nuclear power accident in the United States, but it caused a lot of fear. It was a combination of human and mechanical failure. Nowhere near what Chernobyl was. We had a partial meltdown. There was automatic precautions in here that shut the core down before we could really do serious damage. In Chernobyl, they were kind of testing those automatic precautions and disabled them, and so they didn't come on to prevent this explosion from happening. And so you can see just what a slight difference in human activity made to cause the difference in outcomes. So we did release some radioactive gas, but we don't have any statistically significant increases in cancer. The big outcome from 3 Mile Island is that it polarized the nuclear power sentiment in the United States. A lot of people were against it, especially then when you consider Chernobyl. And so you can see the number of active reactors versus the ones under construction, how it really leveled off here after these two incidents. And it's really been on the decline or the level since then. There's not a lot of them being built anymore. France is one of the big exceptions to that. They really like their nuclear power over in France. This is a picture of 3 Mile Island right here. And so the one that partially melted down is still here on site. You can see it right here to the left with these partially deconstructed cooling towers with it. Right next to it, the other nuclear power plant is still in operation today. And so this is in Pennsylvania. Another big nuclear power plant to know about is the Fukushima Daiichi power plant in Japan. And so this one is famous more recently in 2011 for the earthquake and tsunami that struck the power plant. And so you talk about a bad case of events, really unfortunate, is the tsunami disabled the power supply to the coolers for 3 of the reactors. And so you can see all the damage that this caused. But without the cooling, these reactors overheated quite rapidly, and it caused a triple meltdown. You can see kind of how that earthquake and the tsunami was felt here, but it hit right there on the nuclear power plant, got the brunt of it, and took a significant amount of damage. And it wasn't until 2 years later that we got a cold shutdown achieved, and we finally stopped those fuel rods from reacting with one another. This is a picture of the Fukushima Daiichi plant, what they looked like. And so this red thing here is the pressure vessel. And so one of the bad parts to the design was that the pressure vessel was coated on the inside with a zinc oxide to reduce the corrosion of this due to the reactivity inside. And so when the cooling supply failed, which we don't have on the picture here, but I think it's coming in through this corridor. Once the cooling supply failed and it got so hot, the increased temperature actually caused that magnesium oxide coating to burn, and it ignited the whole thing. And so I believe that the molten fuel rod cells were so hot and so volatile that they seeped the whole way through the floor and into the bedrock below of the plant. The other bad side is the coating in their released hydrogen gas inside a pressurized, very hot container is a recipe for disaster, and it ignited, causing the explosion that kind of rocked these power plants, the ones you can see in this picture out here, that the damage from the explosion. So compare nuclear and coal. So what are the goods, what are the bads? For nuclear, you've got low energy compared to coal's very high net energy. But the benefit to that is it might be low in energy, but it's also low in emissions of CO2 and other pollutants, where coal is quite the opposite. For nuclear, you don't have quite the land disruption because it's not typically mined via strip mining like you do for coal or mountaintop removal. The cost here is very high compared to coal. However, the reason why coal is so cheap is because a lot of these environmental costs get passed to the public for cleaning up the land afterwards. And then the last downside to nuclear that we don't really have anything comparable for coal is that these wastes from nuclear must be stored for thousands of years before they become safe. So think about what you would choose. I think this would be a good topic for us to discuss tomorrow. I'm curious to see if anyone would be in favor of bringing in a nuclear power plant versus the coal plant we do today. So just take a little bit, think about it, maybe jot some ideas down, and be prepared to discuss this tomorrow. Thank you for watching.